You've heard of the Colosseum, the Senate, the legions marching across continents. But tonight, you're not here for marble arches or general speeches. You're here to step behind the curtains of temples, where the Romans didn't just pray. They whispered, bargained, and sometimes lost themselves to cravings no one dared inscribe on public tablets. You're about to walk into a world of gods who looked suspiciously human in their desires, and humans who pretended their desires were divine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? You begin at the Forum, where the city's heart beats loudest. Senators hurry by in spotless togas, pretending virtue is their only companion, while vendors cry out about olives, bread, and spiced wine. Yet, if you linger just past the polished steps, you hear softer sounds, the hiss of whispers, the clink of hidden coins, the rustle of veils. Rome has temples everywhere, but some are not meant for daylight visits. The Romans never separated worship and pleasure the way later faiths tried to. To honor a god was to mirror their strengths, their passions, and yes, their indulgences. Historians still argue whether the earliest Roman temples to love and fertility were genuine houses of worship or cleverly disguised centers for desire. Some accounts describe women dedicating their bodies to Venus as offerings. Others insist these stories are exaggerated by scandal-hungry writers. Either way, the smoke from incense coils in your nose, mixing with the scent of perfume and sweat, and you realize temples were more than places of prayer. They were stages where Rome rehearsed its hungers, a mainstream fact. Archaeologists have found small votive offerings shaped like body parts, arms, legs, and yes, genitals left at shrines, asking for healing or fertility. Imagine showing up at church today with a little clay statue shaped like your elbow or something even less mentionable. Rome didn't bother with subtlety. A quirkier tidbit: some Romans actually believed crocodile dung could be used as a contraceptive, smeared like a holy paste before intimacy. Not exactly the kind of temple blessing you'd expect, though probably effective, if only because it killed the mood immediately. You step through the shadow of a small shrine on the Aventin Hill. The lamps flicker. Statues of Venus are covered not in modest robes, but in thin drapery, marble folds that cling as if they're wet cloth. The ritual isn't violent or obscene, it's careful, rhythmic, and oddly calming. Rome didn't view the body as shameful. It was a vessel for communion with the divine. Still, not everyone approved. Old Cato the Elder once thundered that Rome was rotting from indulgence, and yet whispers say Cato himself couldn't resist sneaking into the occasional tavern where songs grew rowdy and modesty disappeared with the wine. Senators talked a big game by day, but by night the temples had their guest lists filled with very familiar names. You trail past the Tiber, where the water glimmers dark. Along its banks, sailors set up small altars, and foreign deities sneak into Rome's pantheon. Here you hear laughter, and a flute's notes coil through the night. To the Romans, sex wasn't just indulgence, it was fertility, prosperity, and sometimes even politics. You pause, leaning against a column. A passerby drops a coin into a bowl, mutters a prayer, and disappears inside. The door closes softly, and you're left in the hush of Rome's double life. Above ground, the city of law, discipline, empire. Below the surface, temples where incense masked the sound of sighs, and gods were pleased with more than just hymns. And here's your first reality check. The next time someone tries to convince you that the past was all stiff togas and dusty scrolls, remember these shadows. Rome built aqueducts, yes, but it also built temples where worshippers chased ecstasy as seriously as victory on the battlefield. Already, your senses are pulled into the contradictions, the clean lines of marble against the flicker of torches, the crisp rhetoric of senators against the murmurs of lovers in the dark. You realize this story won't be neat or polite. It's a history with lipstick stains on the tablets, perfumes clinging to the marble, and secrets the city never meant to last 2,000 years. You take a deep breath. The incense is heavy. You linger at the edge of twilight in the forum, still catching the last curls of incense from hidden shrines. When the story tugs you further back before Rome's marble temples, before its senators and emperors, you follow the thread across the Mediterranean, where the goddess Aphrodite ruled long before the Romans renamed her Venus, and, like a celebrity rebranded for a new audience, she changed costumes, picked up a new accent, and slipped seamlessly into Rome's lineup of divinities. The Greeks had always treated Aphrodite as more than just a goddess of romance. She embodied raw, irresistible desire, the kind that made even Zeus nervous. In Homer's verses, she manipulates gods and mortals alike, and in sculptors' workshops, her statues are the first to reveal the female body in daring nudity. You can almost imagine a Greek sculptor stepping back from his marble, brush dusting flakes from her curves, muttering, "This is going to scandalize somebody." And he was right it did, especially when those ideas crossed into stern old Rome. Historians still argue whether Venus was always in Rome's pantheon, or if she was fully imported after Rome's contact with Magna Graecia in southern Italy. What's clear is that by the 3rd century BCE, Venus was not just another goddess. She became the Romans' way of blending their own ambitions with imported glamour. Aphrodite represented unfiltered passion. Venus became the face of love, packaged with Roman discipline. You picture a Roman general kneeling before her altar, before battle. Was he asking for victory? Sure. But woven into his prayer was a hope for fertile land, healthy heirs, and maybe a lucky encounter with someone waiting back home. Venus wasn't just about kisses under olive trees. She was tied to prosperity, family, and even politics. Julius Caesar himself claimed descent from her through Aeneas, as if Rome's imperial swagger could be traced directly to a divine bedroom. Now, here's your mainstream historical fact. In 215 BCE, during the Second Punic War, Rome officially dedicated a temple to Venus Erycina on the Capitoline Hill. She was borrowed straight from Sicily after Rome conquered it, and her temple was meant as a cosmic insurance policy against Hannibal's terrifying march. Imagine it. Rome, desperate for divine backup, builds a shrine to the goddess of desire, hoping she distract fate from disaster. And here's your quirky tidbit. Venus Erycina's cult in Sicily originally included what were essentially sacred prostitutes. Worshippers believed that uniting with them was a way to touch the divine. Rome, of course, frowned at the scandalous idea, publicly, privately. Let's just say senators warranty exactly boycotting pilgrimages to that temple when they had the chance. The goddess herself adapted to Roman needs like a seasoned politician. Aphrodite's playful nudity softened into Venus's graceful modesty, but only just. Her statues in Rome often draped her in thin fabric, a clever wink that said, "I'm technically covered, but you're definitely still staring." Venus was not just a goddess of passion. She became the face of love that built dynasties and secured Rome's future. Caesar's Venus Genetrix would later embody this perfect libet that's getting ahead of yourself. You walk through a bustling Roman street. A vendor sells small figurines of Venus carved from ivory. Another hawks garlands of roses for offerings. A mother leads her daughter to a shrine, whispering prayers for a good marriage. A soldier drops a coin, not for love, but for luck. Venus has become everyone's goddess, covering romance, fertility, and political power in one dazzling package. Still, not everyone was thrilled. Conservative voices grumbled that Venus's popularity meant Rome was slipping into softness, trading discipline for indulgence. Cato the Elder, yes, the same grumpy critic from before, warned that Rome's men were spending too much time at shrines to Venus instead of sharpening their swords. Yet you can almost hear the smirk in the crowd, because when Cato finished speaking, half his audience probably walked straight to her altars anyway. The Romans had a knack for absorbing gods and rebranding them. When Aphrodite became Venus, it wasn't just about copying Greece. It was about polishing her up to fit Roman values. But here's the kicker: beneath the polished marble, the same old passions burned. Rome could wrap her in a stola instead of a sheer Greek himation, but the goddess of love was still the goddess of love. You don't just tame desire with a wardrobe change. Historians still debate how much of Aphrodite's original cult survived. You wander deeper into Rome's shadows, the hum of the Forum fading behind you. The air shifts, it feels heavier, perfumed, almost sticky with incense. A narrow street leads you upward toward the Capitoline, where Venus Erycina reigns from her imported Sicilian perch. This isn't just another temple with marble steps and priests mumbling formulas. Here, whispers speak of priestesses whose rituals blur the lines between divine devotion and very human desire. You pause at the threshold, hearing the gentle clash of cymbals and the murmur of prayers that sound suspiciously like invitations. The cult of Venus Erycina was never about restraint. In Sicily, her worship involved courtesans who were considered sacred, not scandalous. They weren't selling themselves. They were offering their bodies as extensions of the goddess, channels through which worshippers touched the divine. The Romans, ever practical, imported the goddess, but tried to keep her rites respectable. Tried being the key word. Historians still argue whether these sacred prostitutes actually operated within the Roman temple itself, or whether the stories were exaggerated by moralists desperate to slander their rivals. Some ancient authors, especially later Christian ones, loved to paint Rome as a city drowning in vice. Others suggest that yes, intimacy was part of the cult, but it carried layers of ritual, sacrifice, and symbolism that made it more than a simple transaction, a mainstream fact. The Temple of Venus Erycina was dedicated in 215 BCE, in the middle of Rome's desperate struggle against Hannibal. Senators believed the goddess could bring protection, fertility, and luck in war. So while soldiers fought bloody battles in the field, back home, citizens sought her blessing in ways that sometimes looked more like indulgence than piety. Imagine fighting for your life in the Alps while your neighbor in Rome is lighting candles and, well, participating in rituals with a priestess for the sake of divine favor. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some traditions, Venus's priestesses wore their hair deliberately loose, cascading over their shoulders during rituals. For Romans, this was a scandal. Married women were expected to keep their hair bound, pinned, and controlled, just like their behavior. Loose hair meant wildness, availability, and freedom. To step into this temple and see priestesses moving with hair unbound was a visual shock, a coded signal that here rules bent. You slip into the temple's dim light. Lamps flicker along the walls, casting long shadows over painted panels. Venus stands at the center, carved in imported marble, lips curved in that half-knowing smile. At her feet, women in flowing gowns move gracefully, not hurried, not ashamed. Worshippers bring coins, garlands of roses, sometimes even small clay offerings shaped like body parts, hips, breasts, and hearts. Each one is laid down with reverence, as if the goddess listens more closely when flesh is acknowledged in fleshly form. A man kneels, whispering a prayer. A priestess bends near him, touches his forehead with oil, and guides him toward the inner chamber. Is it scandalous? Is it sacred? The Romans couldn't decide, and neither can you. What feels certain, standing here, is that the goddess doesn't draw a line between the two. Of course, not everyone was comfortable with this blurred devotion. Conservative voices warned that the cult of Venus Erycina would corrupt Rome's stern values. They argued that soldiers needed iron discipline, not soft pleasures. Yet somehow the temple flourished, because, while senators could rant about morality in daylight, at night their footsteps often led here, echoing softly across the Capitoline steps. Historians still debate whether the cult ever truly normalized sacred sex, or if it was largely symbolic. Some believe that intimacy was a privilege only for certain participants, maybe high-ranking devotees or foreign pilgrims. Others think it was more widespread, a practice woven into Rome's religious fabric. What's undeniable is that the rumor of it was enough to spark endless fascination. Whether exaggerated or real, the temple of Venus Erycina became the city's whispered symbol of devotion entwined with desire. As you wander past an alcove, you spot frescoes faintly painted along the wall. They're not as explicit as the ones in Pompeii's brothels, but their meanings are clear enough. Couples entwined beneath garlands. Venus herself reclining in embrace with Mars. The art reminds you that the goddess's domain was not hidden. It was celebrated openly, even if some pretended to be shocked. You picture a senator storming home late at night, cloak wrapped tightly around his head to avoid recognition, only to trip on his sandal as he sneaks. You leave the Capitoline behind, stepping down cobbled streets where the lamps grow sparser and the stones more cracked. Rome doesn't just worship in the grand temples with glittering marble and golden roofs. No, its hungers spill into the side streets, the cracks, the forgotten corners. Tonight, your path drifts toward the Aventine Hill, where shadows deepen and alleys hide shrines, less polished but perhaps more honest. The Aventine has always been a hill for outsiders. In the Republic, it was where plebeians, the ordinary folks, ate up their homes and their gods. Here, devotion didn't always look like a senator's neat sacrifice of a white bull. Instead, it smelled of cheap incense, mingled with fish from the nearby Tiber markets, and echoed with the laughter of people who couldn't afford the grand shows, but had their own ways of pleasing the divine. Tucked between bakeries and taverns, you stumble on a small doorway lit by a single clay lamp. A faded carving of Venus hovers above it, worn down by rain and fingers that traced her outline for luck. Inside, you find an altar barely bigger than a table, draped with garlands of ivy. Women bow their heads, men whisper prayers, and children peek curiously. Here, Venus isn't a marble statue in imported Greek style. She's a simple clay figure, her curves exaggerated, her features blunt. She's not for emperors, she's for the neighborhood. Historians still argue whether these Aventine shrines were tolerated extensions of Rome's official cults or quietly disapproved sanctuaries. Some say the Senate turned a blind eye, figuring the plebeians needed their own outlets. Others insist such temples were seen as dangerously close to superstition, blurring proper Roman order with indulgence. Either way, they thrived, and judging by the steady stream of visitors, the goddess was very busy here, a mainstream fact. Archaeologists have uncovered countless Larara small household shrines in Rome's humbler districts. Families worshipped their personal gods alongside public deities, sometimes mixing in Venus, Bacchus, or Priapus in ways that would make a censor blush. Religion wasn't just state-run ceremony. It lived in kitchens, back rooms, and hidden corners. Now for the quirky tidbit on the Aventine worshippers, sometimes left offerings of doves live or roasted to Venus. Doves were her sacred birds, symbols of love and fertility. But some cheeky worshippers supposedly tied little ribbons around the birds before releasing them, as if even pigeons needed to dress up for the goddess. Picture a Roman kid chasing after a ribboned dove through the alleyways, while his mother scolds him for turning holy rites into a circus. Inside one shrine, you see a fresco painted directly on the plaster wall. It's crude compared to Pompeii's art, but powerful. Venus reclining, surrounded not by gods, but by ordinary men and women offering fruits, flowers, and themselves. The message is clear. This goddess belongs to everyone, not just the elite. And perhaps that was what made these shrines so magnetic. They gave people a space to bring their desires without judgment. Yet, judgment lingered. A stern voice might mutter that such altars encouraged vice. A passing magistrate might scowl at the sound of music drifting from within. But no law could erase the Aventine's heartbeat. Rome's power was built on the discipline of legions, but its soul was shaped in alleys like these, where worship mixed with pleasure, and the divine was never far from the flesh. Historians still debate whether these makeshift shrines sometimes doubled as brothels. The lines between sacred and profane in Rome were thin as papyrus. Some suggest that offerings weren't always coins or garlands. Sometimes they were shared bodies, gestures of gratitude, or requests for fertility enacted in the dim glow of a lamp. Others argue this is later slander, Rome's moralists eager to paint the Aventine as corrupt. Yet standing here, hearing laughter slip through the doorway, it's hard not to imagine both were true. You step outside again, greeted by the night air, heavier now with smoke from cooking fires. Down the street, another hidden altar glows faintly. This one isn't even inside a room, it's carved into the wall itself, sheltered by a simple awning. Passersby stop briefly, touch the stone, murmur a prayer, and continue. For the weary, for the lovesick, for the hopeful, Venus is always listening, no matter how humble the setting. You smile to yourself, realizing this. While Rome's elite made Venus a symbol of dynasties and victories, the Aventine made her human. She was the goddess of stolen kisses behind a tavern, of wives hoping for children, of men leaving coins with trembling hands. In these shadows, Venus wasn't lofty marble. She was clay and laughter and longing. Here's your gentle joke for the night. If Yelp had existed in Rome, the Aventan shrines would have had 5-star reviews for intimacy and atmosphere, but terrible marks for cleanliness of offerings. The lamps flicker as you wander further uphill. Dogs bark in the distance, children chase one another, and the alley hums with life. Rome is a city of contradictions, mighty temples and humble altars, senators pretending virtue, while ordinary folk embrace their hunger openly. And here on the Aventine, you see how devotion and desire were never separate paths. They were two sides of the same coin, dropped quietly into a clay bowl under the watchful smile of Venus. You linger a moment longer, running your hand across the worn stone of the altar. The grooves carved by centuries of fingers are deep, polished smooth by prayers, both whispered and unspoken. And as you step back into the night, you can almost hear Venus herself chuckle. The Aventine shrines fade behind you, but the night is far from over. Rome has another stage prepared, one where worship slips into spectacle, and devotion tastes like wine on the tongue. You make your way toward a grand villa, its torches blazing, and its gates thrown open to the privileged. Tonight, the goddess isn't served with quiet prayers or humble garlands. Tonight, she is celebrated with overflowing cups, music that refuses to hush, and couches groaning beneath the weight of indulgence. Banquets convivial, as Roman as aqueducts, but some of them, especially those tied to Venus, tilted toward something more than a polite dinner party. You enter a hall draped in purple cloth, lamps casting golden light across silver platters. Guests recline on couches arranged in a U-shape, their sandals tossed aside, their robes deliberately loose. The air smells of roasted boar, glazed with honey, figs stuffed with nuts, and wine spiced with cinnamon. Yet beneath the aroma of food is another scent: perfume, musk, anticipation. Historians still argue whether such banquets were official religious festivals or private reinterpretations of worship. Were these feasts extensions of Venus's rites, or just elite Romans using her name as an excuse for excess? The line was as blurry as the guest's vision after their 5th goblet of Falernian wine. A mainstream fact: Roman banquets followed a 3-part structure: gestatio, appetizers; prima mensa, the main course, and secunda mensa, desserts, often fruits and honey cakes. By the time dessert arrived, conversation had often shifted from politics and philosophy to bolder topics. And if Venus was the goddess invoked that night, you could bet the evening's second half bore little resemblance to sober Senate debates. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Romans used sea urchins and pepper as supposed aphrodisiacs during these feasts. Imagine popping open a spiky little creature, sprinkling pepper, and declaring yourself ready for divine passion. If nothing else, the crunch probably distracted from awkward silences. The music swells, flutes, lyres, and a beat tapped by dancers' feet. Slaves circulate with pitchers, filling cups before they're half empty. At one couch, a guest raises his goblet high and shouts a toast to Venus, calling her the goddess who gives Rome its victories and its pleasures. The room erupts in cheers, wine spilling down beards and over silk. A slave girl leans close to refill a cup, and the man's hand lingers just a moment too long. No one scolds him. After all, Venus herself is the patroness tonight. You notice the walls painted with frescoes, not solemn depictions of gods, but playful scenes of couples reclining, banquets within banquets, laughter carved into color. The Romans didn't hide their pleasures. They dressed them in art and placed them in dining rooms for all to see. For them, beauty, appetite, and intimacy weren't separate. They were threads in the same tapestry. Historians still debate the role of courtesans and entertainers at these feasts. Were they simply performers, or were they part of the worship itself? Some accounts suggest that banquets in honor of Venus ended with guests pairing off, as if the goddess herself orchestrated the seating chart. Others argue that this is exaggeration, moralists trying to paint the elite as decadent. Either way, when you see a guest slip away with a dancer into a side chamber, you understand why the stories persisted. The room grows louder, drunker, freer. A senator, who earlier thundered in the forum about Rome's discipline, is now laughing with his head in a courtesan's lap. A general, who prides himself on iron will, is fumbling his cup, wine-staining his toga. Venus, it seems, levels all ranks, sunder her gaze. Everyone becomes simply human. And here's your joke for the night. If Rome had invented karaoke, these banquets would have been the birthplace of the first drunken rendition of Ode to Venus, wildly off-key but full of heart. You step outside for air, the cool night shocking against your wine-warmed cheeks. From within the villa, laughter roars again, followed by the faint crash of a cup hitting the floor. Rome might call these feasts devotion, but standing here, you realize they're also confession. Guests confessed their hunger for pleasure, their fear of mortality, their desire to be loved, all through food, drink, and the company of others. Banquets of flesh and wine weren't just indulgence. They were rituals of release in a city that demanded discipline by day. Soldiers marched, senators debated, merchants haggled, but at night, the banquet table became a temple, and Venus its high priestess. Every bite, every sip, every stolen glance was an offering. As the torches flicker and the music drifts into the street, you know this. Rome worshipped not only through sacrifice and prayer, but through surrender to appetite. And Venus, smiling slyly from her pedestal, accepted every offering, whether it came as a garland of roses or the last drop of wine sliding from a trembling cup. Morning finds Rome in disarray. The feasts are over, the banquets quiet, but the goddess lingers still, her influence woven into the hangovers, the regrets, and the whispered stories of the night before. You follow the streets as they lead you away from villas and shrines toward a district where Venus was honored in her most direct, earthly form. The lupanar, the brothel. Here, worship and commerce blur, and desire becomes both prayer and payment. Roman prostitution was not a shadow trade. It was woven into the city's fabric, legal, regulated, and taxed. To enter a brothel was not shameful, it was ordinary, expected, almost civic. Men visited not in secret, but in daylight, sometimes with their sons or friends. For them, Venus wasn't distant marble, but living flesh. The lupanar of Pompeii gives us our clearest window into this world. Step inside that two-story building, and you'd find narrow rooms with stone beds, frescoes above each door depicting various erotic acts menus painted in plaster. Clients didn't need to fumble with words. They pointed to the scene they wanted, as if ordering dinner. The walls themselves were instruction manuals, promises, and advertisements all at once. Here, as a mainstream fact, prostitutes in Rome were called meretresses if they were registered and taxed, or prostibulae if they worked without license. Their earnings could be confiscated if they weren't properly declared. Even the goddess of love, it seems, bowed to Roman bureaucracy. And here's your quirky tidbit. Brothel tokens, called spintriae, were sometimes used instead of coins. These small bronze pieces depicted explicit acts on one side and numbers on the other, perhaps functioning as tickets or vouchers. Imagine sliding one across a counter, not unlike ordering a glass of wine, except the service delivered was Venus incarnate. The lupanar was not glamorous. Its corridors were dim, its rooms cramped, its mattresses little more than straw stuffed in sacks. Yet it was honest in a way the banquet halls were not. Here, desire was stripped of its perfume and marble trappings. It was coin for touch, transaction as ritual. The women many enslaved, some freebore names like Xethrus or even Venus herself, nicknames chosen to blur identity with divinity. Moralists sneered, of course. Cicero called prostitutes necessary for the stability of the state, a pressure valve to keep citizens from greater scandals. Others warned that indulgence corrupted discipline. Yet the brothels thrived, because beneath all rhetoric, Rome knew its heart. Listen closely, and you hear the sounds. Sandals slapping across worn thresholds, laughter tinged with nervousness, the jingling of coins. A man emerges, adjusting his tunic, already calculating whether he can spare another denarius tomorrow. A woman leans against a doorway, her eyes tired but sharp, already judging the next client. Somewhere in the corner, a scribe scribbles graffiti, a crude drawing, a boast, a slur. Even their walls prayed to Venus, in chalk and ink. The goddess presided here no less than in temples. Her statues sometimes stood in niches above doorways, garlands draped on their stone shoulders. Clients might whisper her name before or after, unsure whether they were honoring or excusing themselves. Worship, in this place, meant giving in to weakness and paying the price. And here, a joke whispered among Romans. A man prays in the temple for children, then visits the brothel to practice. The brothel was also an equalizer. Senators and soldiers, merchants and slaves, all passed through the same narrow doorways. Rank mattered less than the clink of coin. The goddess welcomed all at least, all who could pay, and in that leveling, in that mingling of high and low, Venus displayed her peculiar power to strip men of their titles and reduce them to what they were underneath, mortal, yearning, fragile. Yet the Lupana was also a mirror of Rome's cruelty. Most women there had no choice. Enslaved, bought young, or captured in war, they were reduced to offerings on an altar they had not chosen. Their bodies kept the city's desires fed, but their prayers, if they dared whisper them, often went unheard. To honor Venus here was also to face the truth. Devotion can be exploitation, and worship can wear the mask of hunger. You linger at the threshold, uneasy. The feasts of last night now seem gilded, but this place is stripped bare. Venus has many faces, and this one is both blunt and brutal. As you step back into the street, the day brightens, the marketplace stirs, and the ordinary life of Rome resumes. But the brothel's shadow follows you. You understand now why Venus was both adored and feared. She could inspire devotion as pure as a garland of roses, or as transactional as a coin pressed into a calloused hand. Rome did not hide her. Rome embraced her. And through her temples, her banquets, her brothels, the city confessed the truth it could never legislate away. The hunger for love, for flesh, for touch, was as Roman as marble and empire. You drift with the hum of the forum in your ears, past senators muttering about markets and soldiers clattering along cobblestones, until the sound bends and twists toward something darker. Drums, not the steady beat of legionaries, but wild, uneven pounding, paired with the clash of cymbals and the echo of flutes. Someone laughs too loudly. Someone cries. You follow the noise into shadows, toward the Aventine, and there you stumble into a scene Rome itself tried to erase, the Bacchanalia. At first glance, it feels like a festival, and in truth, that's how it began. The worship of Bacchus, or Dionysus, if you prefer his Greek name, came to Rome as a relatively harmless rite. Wine, dancing, celebration of fertility wasn't much different from other cultic observances. But over time, those quiet gatherings turned into something more unpredictable. Picture it: a circle of initiates, men and women together, bathed in torchlight, garlands slipping from their hair, their movements fevered and fluid. Amphories spill over with wine, staining the ground dark red, while hands reach for each other with no thought of tomorrow. In this place, social rank disappears. Senators embrace slaves. Matrons shed their dignity like cloaks. The rites promise freedom from Rome's suffocating order, a taste of chaos, blessed by a god who lived for indulgence. Here's your mainstream fact: the Senate didn't like this at all. In 186 BCE, the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus was issued, a decree that restricted and largely suppressed the Bacchanalia, the official reason. They claimed the cult involved criminal conspiracies, murders, and political treason. But scratch the surface, and it's clear. What really scared them was the loss of control. Thousands of Romans, across all classes, uniting in ecstatic frenzy. That was dangerous. And here's your quirky tidbit. According to one account, Bacchic initiates wore fawn skins and carried 30 long staffs tipped with ivy and sometimes hollowed out to conceal daggers. Imagine the Senate's horror at a parade of tipsy devotees carrying what might have been literal concealed weapons disguised as party favors. Historians still argue whether the Bacchanalia were truly criminal conspiracies or simply scapegoated for their wildness. Maybe the rites were exaggerated by scandalized senators who needed a pretext to tighten order. Maybe Rome feared pleasure as much as treason. But standing there, you sense the pulse of it. The air reeks of spilled wine, sweat, and incense. A woman sways, with her eyes closed, chanting to Bacchus. A man collapses into laughter, so deep it shakes his whole body. Somewhere in the throng, another begins to wail, not in pain, but in release, as though all the strictures of Roman life have melted away. And yes, there's fear here. What happens when everyone forgets rank? What happens when men and women share ecstasy as equals? The Senate didn't just fear chaos, they feared inversion. Rome ran on hierarchy: patrician over plebeian, master over slave, husband over wife. The Bacchanalia tore those lines apart. Of course, you can't ignore the darker whispers. Stories claimed the cult practiced secret murders, that initiates were drowned in rivers or sacrificed to Bacchus when they betrayed secrets. Was it true or just Senate propaganda? You'll never know. All you hear are fragments of laughter and cries. Still, imagine the irony. Rome banned the Bacchanalia for being too wild. Yet years later, emperors would host orgies in palaces so extravagant they made Bacchus himself look like a teetotaler. Nothing says Rome quite like condemning indulgence in public while feasting on it in private. And here's your joke. You overhear a Roman mutter. The Senate outlawed the Bacchanalia because they weren't invited. When the crackdown came, it was brutal. Temples were destroyed, worshippers arrested, sometimes executed. Priests were forbidden to gather in numbers greater than 5 without explicit permission. The Bacchic flame, however, never really died. The god of wine was too stubborn to vanish. His rites went underground, whispered in smaller circles, hidden behind locked doors. Even centuries later, echoes of his frenzy surface in other cults, in festivals, in Rome's inability to resist excess for long. As you step away from the noise, the city's order creeps back in the clack of sandals, the measured Latin of magistrates, the carved geometry of marble columns. But you've seen what lies beneath it. Rome wasn't just law and empire. It was also pulse and frenzy, laughter and sobbing, masks slipping in torchlight. And the memory clings to you. The idea that in the heart of a city obsessed with control, thousands once chose chaos. They chose to lose themselves in a god of wine, to dissolve boundaries, to surrender. Maybe the Senate thought it was treason. Maybe it was. But it was also worship, the kind Rome could never quite exorcise. You walk away from the hushed remnants of Bacchic drums, but the echo lingers, like wine still on your tongue. The Romans had a way of making gods both terrifying and comic, and no deity illustrates that better than Priapus. Step into a Roman garden, and you might bump into him literally. He is everywhere, lurking behind grapevines, perched near fountains, standing boldly in painted frescoes. And there's no mistaking him, because Priapus is forever displayed with one feature impossible to ignore, a phallus so exaggerated it borders on parody. Priapus, a rustic fertility god from Asia Minor, was adopted by Rome with gleeful irreverence. His statues guarded orchards, vineyards, and gardens, not because Romans found him purely ornamental, but because they believed his obscene presence could ward off thieves and envy. The threat was simple: steal my figs, and Priapus will punish you in a way you'll never forget. Some statues even carried inscriptions, witty, vulgar poems, promising violators a very personal kind of retribution. You could say he was the original beware of dogs sign, except much less subtle. Here's your mainstream fact. Priapus was considered a minor deity, but his cult was widely spread. Archaeological finds show hundreds of terracotta figurines and frescoes featuring him, particularly in Pompeii and Herculaneum. His worship was light-hearted, but real. He was invoked for fertility of crops, animals, and even households. And here's the quirky tidbit. Roman doctors sometimes recommended tiny Priapus amulets to cure impotence. Imagine carrying a little bronze charm of an eternally ready god in your toga pocket, as if his enthusiasm might be contagious. Historians still argue whether Priapus was treated as a serious fertility god or simply as comic relief. Was he genuinely worshipped, or was he more of a running joke in Rome's vast pantheon? The answer may be both, depending on who was watching. You picture walking through a villa garden. Flowers bloom, vines stretch toward the sun, bees hum lazily, and there he is, Priapus, carved in marble or painted on plaster, glaring at you with mischievous eyes. A basket of fruit sits at his feet, symbolic offerings to ensure abundance. Yet the exaggerated feature, towering above the basket, makes it impossible not to snicker. Romans delighted in this blend of sacred and ridiculous. They saw no contradiction in praying to Priapus for fertile vines, while also chuckling at his obscene warnings. One famous epigram, attributed to the Priapia collection, has Priapus threatened trespassers with an assault so specific you almost hear the garden owner cackling as he ordered it inscribed. And of course, children grew up surrounded by these images. To Romans, Priapus wasn't scandalous. He was comic, protective, and a bit embarrassing, like an eccentric uncle at family gatherings. Only later, under stricter Christian moral codes, would his statues be buried or hidden, deemed too indecent for pious eyes. You linger by one fresco in Pompeii. Priapus leans casually against a wall, holding the scales of commerce. On one side of the scale, a heap of gold coins. On the other, his oversized attribute outweighing the fortune. The message is unsubtle. Fertility and virility matter more than wealth. Or perhaps, for the Romans, they were wealth. A Roman passerby might mutter a joke. Gold buys bread, but Priapus grows it. Another might add, he also makes sure no one steals it. Humor and reverence entwined, inseparable. And here, as your modern aside, Priapus was essentially Rome's patron saint of awkward garden parties. Forget marble busts of emperors. What really kept thieves away was the threat of divine humiliation carved in stone. But don't be fooled into thinking Priapus was harmless. For Romans, fertility was serious business. Without fertile crops, there was famine. Without fertile women, there was no future for the family line. His grotesque imagery masked an essential truth. Life depended on successful reproduction. Priapus was a joke, yes, but he was also insurance. The irony, of course, is that Priapus himself was said to be cursed with impotence, in some myths eternally aroused but unable to consummate. The gods, it seems, had a cruel sense of humor. Imagine worshipping a fertility deity whose own condition mocked the very thing he symbolized. It's almost too Roman, that blend of contradiction. As you leave the garden, the laughter fades, but his shadow lingers. Priapus is hard to forget, whether you view him as comic guardian or divine symbol. He embodies Rome's peculiar genius to turn sacred ritual into satire, and satire back into sacred ritual, until you can't tell which is which. You've wandered through Roman gardens with Priapus chuckling at your back. But now the air thickens with incense sweeter than any vineyard. The city hums with gossip about foreign gods, and you feel yourself pulled toward the banks of the Tiber, where ships unload not just grain and spices, but deities. Tonight, you slip into the company of sailors and merchants who whisper about a goddess from Egypt, one whose temples glow with torchlight and whose promises seem forbidden. Her name is Isis. The cult of Isis arrived in Rome long before it was officially welcomed. Traders brought her rites from Alexandria, and her temples began to sprout quietly in the neighborhoods near the river. They weren't the grand marble sanctuaries of Jupiter or Mars, at first more like hidden chapels tucked into warehouses, but the goddess's presence was magnetic. Her worshippers spoke of healing, protection, and rebirth, and unlike the stiff rituals of Jupiter's priests, Isis offered something Rome rarely gave: intimacy. Here's your mainstream fact. The cult of Isis became so popular in Rome that despite repeated bans by the Senate in the late Republic, her temples were rebuilt again and again. Eventually, under the emperors, she gained official recognition, and her shrines stood proudly beside Rome's most traditional temples. And here's the quirky tidbit. Roman initiates of Isis sometimes shaved their heads as a sign of devotion. Picture a Roman aristocrat, otherwise draped in finery, walking around bald-headed like a monk, declaring allegiance to a foreign goddess of the Nile. For a society obsessed with appearances, it was both shocking and oddly fashionable. Historians still argue whether the cult's appeal lay mainly in its promises of personal salvation or in its secretive, emotionally charged rituals. Was it faith, or was it the thrill of the exotic? You slip inside one of her temples. The walls gleam with painted lotuses and stars. Statues of Isis wear crowns shaped like thrones, her gown flowing like the Nile itself. Oil lamps flicker, and the air is thick with incense that smells of cinnamon and honey. Priests chant in a language you don't understand, Egyptian syllables rolling like water. And then you see it, women and men together, kneeling side by side, whispering prayers for fertility, for healing, for love. This worship is sensual, but not crude. There's no drunken frenzy here, no lewd graffiti on walls. Instead, there's touch hands laid gently on shoulders, fingers brushing across beads, the pressing of lips against amulets. Devotion here feels like embrace. You sense why Romans flocked to her. In a city of rigid law and harsh discipline, Isis gave softness. And make no mistake, Rome both craved and feared that softness. The Senate banned her temples several times, citing foreign corruption. Yet each time they tore them down, Romans rebuilt them in secret, drawn by her promises. Even emperors couldn't resist. Caligula, ever the showman, supported her openly. And later, emperors built her grand temples, including the massive Isium Campense, near today's Piazza Navona. Step outside her shrine, and you'd see statues of Anubis, the jackal-headed guide of the dead, and Harpocrates, the child god of silence. Finger pressed to lips, as if to say, what happens here stays here. That secrecy only added allure. And here's the joke, Romans might mutter. You go to Isis to find peace, and return with perfume in your toga your wife doesn't recognize. For many women, especially, Isis offered empowerment. In a society where women's roles were tightly bound, here they could serve as priestesses, lead rituals, and find spiritual authority. No wonder matrons slipped into her temples, often leaving richer in spirit than when they entered. As you linger, you notice that worship of Isis isn't about abandoning Rome, about finding refuge within it. Sailors pray for safe voyages. Mothers pray for children's health. Lovers pray for fidelity. Even soldiers come, secretly, asking her for protection on campaign. The irony, later, when Christianity rose, critics accused Christians of copying the Isiac mysteries, baptism-like rituals, promises of eternal life, the image of a mother with her divine child. Historians still argue whether early Christian practices borrowed directly from Isis, or whether the similarities are coincidence, born of shared human longing. But here, tonight, in the flickering torchlight, you see why Isis mattered. She was foreign yet familiar, sensual yet sacred, offering Rome something its own gods rarely did: compassion in her temples. Worship wasn't just duty, it was comfort. You step back into the cool Roman night, incense clinging to your hair, the sound of foreign hymns echoing in your ears. You realize Rome was never just marble and discipline. It was also hunger for touch, for healing, for a goddess who promised that even in the chaos of empire, someone cared. The incense of Isis still clings to you as you wander deeper into Rome, but the sound changes. No laughter from lupanors, no cymbals from Bacchic nights. Instead, silence the kind that makes you lower your voice without meaning to. You arrive at a place where fire burns, not in torches, but in a sacred hearth, tended by the most carefully watched women in Rome, the Vestal Virgins. You picture the circular temple rising near the Forum, its columns white against the blue sky. Inside, the eternal flame flickers, a symbol of Rome's life itself. If that fire went out, people believed disaster would follow, famine or invasion. And so the task of tending it fell to 6 women, chosen as children, sworn to chastity for 30 years. Their lives weren't theirs anymore. They belonged to the goddess Vesta, to Rome itself. Here's your mainstream fact. Vestal virgins enjoyed privileges rare for Roman women. They could own property, make wills, and were honored with seats of distinction at public games. Even powerful men moved aside when a Vestal passed. And here's your quirky tidbit. Vestals had their own special escort called a lictor. If they encountered a condemned prisoner by chance, they could pardon him simply by touching him. Imagine stumbling across one on your way to execution and suddenly walking free, just because you brushed against sacred skirts. Historians still argue whether the Vestals were truly empowered by their position or merely imprisoned in gilded cages. To some, they were honored priestesses. To others, they were state hostages, bound by impossible vows. Step inside their house, the Atrium Vesta. Marble floors gleam. Pools reflect the sky. Yet behind the grandeur, their lives were carefully monitored. Tutors drilled them. Officials inspected them. Rome watched always. Their purity wasn't just personal, it was political. And the punishment for breaking that vow, unthinkable. If a Vestal was found guilty of unchastity, she wasn't executed outright to sacred for blood to be spilled. Instead, she was entombed alive in a chamber underground, given a lamp, a little food, a little water, and left to fade. Rome buried its shame with her. You feel the chill just imagining it. Yet, despite the danger, some Vestals whispered about lovers. Scandalous tales spread through the streets. Affairs with generals, with senators. Were they true? Or inventions of political rivals eager to tarnish reputations? Historians still debate each case, poring over accusations like gossip centuries later. As you linger by the flame, you feel its warmth, but also its weight. These women lived under constant scrutiny. Their triumph was keeping the fire alive. Their terror was letting desire betray them. You can almost hear one of them muttering under her breath, "No pressure, right?" before gently feeding another log into the hearth. And yet, you sense the contradiction. Rome valued the Vestals because they embodied chastity, discipline, and devotion qualities. Rome praised but rarely practiced. Senators railed against indulgence in speeches, then slipped into brothels by night. Emperors lectured on morality, then hosted private feasts of excess. Meanwhile, 6 women kept the fire burning, day and night, year after year, the city's conscience embodied in fragile flame. Here, a Roman joke you catch, whispered. Better to be a Vestal prisoner than her boyfriend. The humor hides the fear behind it. And still, there's admiration to a Vestal walking through the Forum was untouchable. People stepped aside. Even the roughest soldiers lowered their voices. She carried both awe and unease, as though she herself were the goddess in mortal form. You stand close enough to the fire to feel its heat on your skin. For a moment, you think of all the nights Rome's citizens slept peacefully, trusting that somewhere 6 women kept watch. They never married, never raised children, yet, in a way, they mothered the entire city. Step back into the streets, and you realize something. Rome's temples of sex and desire were everywhere: brothels, shrines, feasts, but its strictest guardians were here, sworn to the opposite. Together, indulgence and restraint formed the heartbeat of Rome, each incomplete without the other. The flame flickers, the vestals move silently, white veils trailing. You know they'll still be here long after you leave, tending the fire until history itself decides otherwise. The road into Uruk is less of a road and more of a scar etched into the earth, a line carved by centuries of sandals, hooves, and wagon wheels. By the time you shuffle beneath its outer ramparts, the dust has worked its way into your teeth, your hair, the seams of your tunic. But the city ahead gleams like a mirage against the horizon, unlike the scattered villages you've passed. Uruk is alive, its ziggurat rising toward the sky, its walls stretching so wide you wonder how human hands ever built them. You've heard whispers in taverns and shrines that these walls are the very bones of Gilgamesh's pride, his song etched into brick. To walk them is to hear the city's heartbeat. But you are not here to marvel. You are here because you need work, food, and maybe, if the gods will it, a place where the sound of your own thoughts doesn't echo so loudly. And Uruk, with its towers and temples, offers opportunities for hands like yours, worn and calloused from endless toil. The guards at the gate hardly look at you. You are no threat, just another weary body in a long stream of pilgrims, merchants, and beggars. Still, you notice their spears, gleaming with the kind of polish only authority can afford. Behind them, the smell of the city strikes. Incense burned for Inanna, roasted lamb, fat dripping over coals, sewage baking in the sun. Uruk is no paradise, but it hums with a kind of promise that almost feels like music. Inside, you wander streets crammed with life. Women in dyed wool trade clay jars of beer. Children chase each other between stalls. Their laughter, a counterpoint to the cries of sellers hawking grain, reeds, and oil. You see scribes, hunched over clay tablets, their reeds stilly, ticking like insect legs. Priests chant beneath painted reliefs, their voices meant for gods, but audible to everyone. It's overwhelming, and for a moment you feel swallowed by it. You are searching for something quieter, and you find it not in a temple or market, but in a half-collapsed courtyard where stonemasons work. Their mallets rise and fall with a rhythm that seems more deliberate than the chaos outside. The stone sings under their tools, soft notes of obedience, sparks of resistance. Something in you stirs at that rhythm. Stone, unlike men, cannot betray. It can be shaped, coaxed, persuaded, but never truly deceives. The overseer eyes you when you approach. His tunic is plain, but his gaze is sharp, assessing whether you're another vagrant with empty words. You show him your hands hard-lined, thick with scars. You have nothing else to prove your worth. He nods once, curt, and points you toward a block waiting to be squared. It feels strange, almost holy, to pick up the chisel. The first strike jars through your arm, reminding you how unforgiving stone can be. But soon, your movements fall into the rhythm of the others. Strike, pause, shift. The stone yields slowly, revealing the shape hidden within. You lose yourself in the work. Hours pass like moments. When dusk descends and the sky burns copper, you sit among the masons. They share bread and onions, passing skins of watered beer. No one speaks much. Words seem unnecessary when your bodies have already spoken through sweat and rhythm. You belong, if only for tonight. Later, when the courtyard empties, you remain. The stone blocks loom like sleeping giants around you. You rest your back against one and close your eyes. The city outside still roars with life drums, laughter, shouting, but here the stone hums softly like a lullaby. You think of your mother, though her face blurs now when you try to recall it. You think of the way she hummed to you in the dark, the notes simple but steady, the same steadiness you now hear in the stone. The gods, you realize, may speak through priests, kings, or storms, but they also speak here, in silence, in wait, in patience. Each strike of the chisel is a prayer. Each scar in the rock is a hymn. You drift half into sleep and half into memory. You see the walls of Uruk, not as they are, but as they will, be taller, stronger, each brick etched with names, so that no man is ever truly forgotten. You imagine your own hands somewhere in that memory, not celebrated, not carved into song, but present. The lullaby continues in your chest. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, you do not feel the hollow ache of wandering. You are still rootless, still nameless, still at the mercy of fate. But tonight the stone holds you, steady as the earth. And for a brief, fragile moment, you almost believe that, here, in this city of noise and gods, you have found something resembling home. You learn quickly that in Uruk, nothing is ever truly free. The bread the masons shared, the courtyard that gave you rest, even the stone that seemed to sing to you is part of a web held tight by hands stronger than yours. And at the center of that web sits not a king, but the temple. The great ziggurat of Inanna rises above everything, its terraces stacked like steps to heaven, each one a proclamation that the gods walk nearer to Uruk than anywhere else. You see it each morning, a constant reminder that even when you labor in dust and sweat, someone is always watching. It starts innocently enough. A priest approaches the courtyard. His robes are not as fine as those of the high clergy, but the hem is clean, dyed with saffron. His eyes, though, are sharper than any blade. He does not ask who you are, he already knows you do not belong. Instead, he asks what you believe. His voice is soft, almost kind, but the question coils around you like a rope. You stumble through an answer. You mention sacrifices, offerings, the names of gods you half remember from your mother's lips. He nods, yet his gaze does not release you. You realize then, in Uruk, work is not enough. To carve stone, to carry weight these things, feed bodies. But to exist here, you must also feed the temple, the hunger of gods and those who speak for them. Soon after, you are summoned, not ordered, but summoned, the way a leaf is summoned by the river's pull. The masons say nothing, but their silence tells you everything. Refuse, and you vanish into dust. Accept, and you enter another rhythm, one older and more dangerous than stone. Inside the temple, the air changes. Incense clogs your lungs. The floor is cool beneath your bare feet, polished smooth by generations of worshippers. Carvings line the walls, scenes of battle, of gods granting favor, of supplicants kneeling. You feel small beneath their gaze, a shadow among shadows. The priest leads you deeper, past chambers where women chant to Inanna, their voices weaving like threads, past storerooms where grain and oil are stacked like tribute to the sky. Finally, into a chamber where light filters from a high slit, striking an altar of black stone. On it rests nothing but a bowl of water, yet you feel as if the bowl sees you. You have strong hands, the priest says, hands that shape stone, but stone is mute unless given voice. Here we carve not only walls but truths. He gestures to a row of tablets. Each one bears lines pressed into clay words you cannot read. To you, they look like patterns left by reeds on river mud. But you know they are more than that. They are spells, contracts, commands. They are power captured in form. The priest studies you, waiting. You feel your chest tighten. He does not need to say it. If you wish to remain, you must serve not only with hands, but with devotion. The gods do not tolerate half-hearted offerings. You kneel, though your knees ache from days of labor. You whisper a vow, fully understanding to whom or what you bind yourself. The priest smiles, thin and unreadable. He touches your forehead with water from the bowl. It drips down your brow like sweat, cold and heavy. From that moment, your work changes. You are still a mason, yes, but your blocks are no longer just walls. They are for the temple's expansion, the sacred halls where gods demand to dwell. Each strike of your chisel is now a prayer, whether you mean it or not. And always, you feel the priest's eyes on you, even when he is nowhere near. The masons begin to treat you differently, not with hostility, but with distance. As if you've crossed some invisible threshold they dare not approach. You eat alone. You sleep alone. Even the stone feels heavier in your hands, as if reminding you that every shape you carve is no longer yours. To give it belongs to something vast and insatiable. Nights grow darker. The lullaby you once heard in stone is harder to find. Instead, whispers fill the silence. Whispers of debts, of sacrifices, of those who disappeared after the temple claimed them. You dream of water bowls staring back at you, of eyes in the stone where no eyes should be. One night, unable to bear the weight, you climb the half-finished walls of Uruk. The city stretches beneath you, lanterns glowing like stars scattered across the earth. Beyond, the desert breathes under the moon. For a moment, you imagine walking away, vanishing into the silence of the dunes, leaving behind the city, the priest, the stone. But then you hear it, the distant echo of drums from the temple, steady, inescapable. They bind you like chains. You realize the truth. Uruk does not release those it has taken. It remakes them, brick by brick, until they cannot imagine life outside its walls. When you climb down, your hands raw from gripping the stone, you know the priest will see it in your eyes, that flicker of rebellion, and you know he will not let it go unnoticed. The next morning, he is waiting, not with anger, but with a smile, to calm, to be kind. The gods are watching you, he says, as if it were both a warning and a promise. And you believe him, because by now, you've begun to feel their gaze too. By now, you've learned the rhythm of Uruk, the hammering of chisels, the shuffle of traders, the incense-thick air around the ziggurat. But there is another rhythm beneath it, all quieter, like a heartbeat muffled by walls. You start to hear it in conversations that stop the moment you enter, in glances exchanged at dusk, in the way laughter falls silent whenever a priest walks by. It's the rhythm of fear. The masons who once welcomed you now murmur about the debt of the city, not the debt of silver or grain, but of flesh, of loyalty, of knights surrendered to the temple's hidden chambers. They never say too much. They don't need to. You've seen enough to understand that the temple does not just shape stone, it shapes people. One evening, while hauling water, you pass near the market and hear a senator railing against decadence in public. His voice is righteous, his fingers stabbing the air, condemning indulgence as weakness. But behind him, in the same crowd, you catch the smirk of a merchant who whispers that the senator himself is seen slipping into temple doors long after midnight. You can't help but laugh quietly at the hypocrisy, though you make sure no one hears. Historians still argue whether Uruk's leaders truly believed in the sanctity of Inanna's rites, or whether they simply used them as instruments of control. But to you, there's no argument. Belief and manipulation blur until you can tell one from the other. The priest's eyes follow you more closely these days. You notice one in particular, older, his hair thin and his lips always moving as if reciting prayers. He never speaks to you directly, yet he is always near. When you carry blocks to the temple steps, when you draw water at dusk, even once when you woke in the courtyard to find him standing in shadow, watching as though measuring your dreams. The masons say his name is Namtar, whispered, always whispered. They tell you he is favored by Inanna, or perhaps feared by her. Nobody seems sure. They only know that those who fall under his gaze soon find themselves invited to serve more deeply. Some return, changed, silent, withdrawn. Others never return at all. One night, you find yourself summoned again. Not to the black stone altar, but to a smaller chamber, lit by flickering oil lamps. Namtar is there. He greets you not as a laborer, but as if you are a supplicant, though you never asked to be. He speaks softly, asking if your hands ache, if your back bends too low, if you feel the city's hunger pressing into your bones. Each question feels less like kindness and more like a net tightening. He tells you, Ramtho, you re-centuries too early to call it, that believes itself mighty because of laws and walls. But Uruk's true strength, he says, lies in binding people with desire and fear in equal measure. Desire pulls them close. Fear keeps them from running away. And you, he claims, are now part of that balance. You want to protest? You want to say you are just a stonecutter, a wanderer, a man with no ties. But the words stick in your throat. Because you know he is right. Uruk has already woven you into its fabric. Later, outside, you watch the city glitter under torchlight. The air smells of dates and dust. Laughter bursts from a tavern, and for a moment, Uruk feels almost ordinary. But the priest's words cling to you, desire and fear. You see them everywhere now. The lovers huddled in an alley, clutching each other in desperation. The trader bribing a guard with figs. The child sneaking bread while glancing over his shoulder. The senator who shouts about purity in the day and kneels at the temple by night. You can't escape the sense that you, too, are being pulled between those forces, stretched thinner each day. There's a rumor among the masons, half joke, half warning, that the stones themselves remember what they see. That if you press your ear to the walls of the ziggurat at night, you will hear moans, confessions, prayers whispered so fervently they burned into the clay forever. One drunk even swears he heard his own voice in the wall once, though he never remembered speaking. You laugh with the others at the tale, but later, alone, you wonder if the stones you chisel might one day tell your secrets too. A strange thing happens after that. The lullaby you once felt in stone returns, but it is no longer soothing. Now it thrums with urgency, like a drumbeat warning of something approaching. When you sleep, you dream of the walls rising higher and higher, not to honor gods, but to trap you inside. And when you wake, you realize Uruk itself feels alive, a beast made of stone and flesh, feeding on devotion and indulgence alike. Historians today debate whether such temples were centers of genuine faith or clever instruments of political dominance. Walking these streets, you don't need debate. You can feel the duality in your bones, the awe that lifts you skyward and the leash that keeps you tethered. The next time you pass Namtar, he doesn't speak. He only smiles, thin as a knife, and you understand, whether you resist or surrender, Uruk already owns you, and that's the most dangerous rhythm of all. You start hearing arguments that aren't meant for you. They drift like smoke across the courtyards, rising from the lips of men who speak with hands as much as words. They call themselves philosophers, though they look more like idle scribes or priests too stubborn to kneel. They debate not the weight of stone or the cost of grain, but the meaning of hunger, of longing, of the body itself. You sit at the edge of their circle one evening, your skin still streaked with dust from the day's labor. They don't chase you away. Perhaps they enjoy an audience. One, draped in a faded linen robe, argues that pleasure is the natural compass of life. Why else would the gods plant desire in your chest, if not to guide you? To him, every taste of fruit, every caress, every drop of wine is a fragment of divinity. Another scoffs. He insists that indulgence weakens the soul, that to chase after pleasure is to let chains be fastened around your own wrists. The strong, he claims, find freedom in denial. He quotes verses, long strings of words that sound like poetry but strike like hammers. His voice is steady, but his eyes flick nervously toward the temple, as though even his own conviction is fragile. Historians still argue whether Uruk truly had such debates in organized schools, or whether we project later philosophies back onto these earliest cities. But for you, sitting under the rising moon, the clash of voices feels real enough to shape the night. You notice how the crowd leans differently with each speaker. Some laugh and clap at the Epicurean, who preaches life as a banquet where every bite should be savored. Others nod gravely at the Stoic, who insists that discipline is the only shield against chaos. And somewhere between them, you sit, feeling tugged in both directions. You think of the bread shared by masons on your first day, of the laughter that tasted sweeter than figs. That memory is proof of the banquet of pleasure as a gift. Yet you also think of Namtor's eyes, of the way the temple binds desire into chains. Maybe the Stoic is right. Maybe every soft indulgence is just bait. The philosophers themselves do not resolve it. They argue until the stars wheel overhead, until the fire burns low, until their voices crack. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the circle breaks apart. Some wander into taverns for wine. Others retreat into shadows to pray. You remain where you are, torn between their voices that still echo in your skull. Days blur. You carry stone, you carve blocks, you sweat until your back screams. But in each strike of the chisel, the argument plays again. Each spark from the stone becomes a question: pleasure or discipline, banquet or chain. You wonder if anyone has ever chosen correctly, or if both paths only lead back to the temple's waiting mouth. One afternoon, you glimpse something that unsettles you. A priest, one of the loudest moralists, is caught slipping from the brothel, painted with frescoes of laughing gods. He notices your stare and glares back, daring you to speak. You don't, you only turn away, but inside you laugh bitterly. So much for chains and discipline. Even the guardians of virtue sneak to the banquet table when no one is looking. That night, you hear whispers of a secret gathering. Not Bacchanalia, the Senate would still be centuries away from outlawing those, but something similar. Wine, music, and bodies pressed too close. You follow the sound to a courtyard where torches flicker against painted walls. Inside, dancers twirl, their movements slow, suggestive, mocking the sermons of restraint. Men and women alike raise cups, their mouths stained with pomegranate juice and wine. For a moment, you stand at the threshold, frozen. You know this is the banquet the philosopher described. You know also it is the trap the Stoic warned of parrot, because sometimes hunger decides before the mind does. The night swallows you. You drink, you laugh, you let hands brush yours. For the first time in weeks, you forget the weight of stone. You forget the priest's eyes. You forget even your own name. There is only music, heat, and the dizzying sense that perhaps, just perhaps, the banquet is the closest mortals ever come to touching the gods. But at dawn, when you stumble back to your sleeping mat, the taste of wine still clinging to your lips, the guilt arrives, heavy, sour, as if the Stoic himself whispers in your ear. You've traded strength for weakness. You've surrendered the one thing that was yours, the choice to resist. You wonder then if the philosophers truly sought answers, or if their debates were simply mirrors for the confusion that has always lived inside you. Maybe the banquet and the chain are not opposites, but twins, each feeding the other. Desire tempts, discipline condemns, and between them you swing like a pendulum, never still. Historians debate whether philosophy ever shaped Uruk's soul, or whether it was only the temple that mattered. But you know better, even as you haul stone beneath the sun. Even as your sweat soaks the dust, it is not the temple that gnaws at you most. It is the argument endless, unsolved carving your mind the way your chisel carves the wall. And in the silence between hammer strikes, you hear yourself whisper the question no priest dares ask. What if neither the banquet nor the chain leads to freedom? What if freedom is only the illusion we chase while the city feeds on us all the same? The stone does not answer, but its silence feels heavier than words. The palace always seemed far away, like a star glittering above the dust of your world. From the courtyard where you sleep, you could glimpse its outline walls, rising smoother than any you ever laid. Roofs painted with colors that the masons whisper about, but never see up close. To you, it was just another unreachable height, like the ziggurat or the gods themselves, until one day you are summoned. It comes not as a request, but as an order, carried by a guard whose bronze dagger flashes with each step. He does not look at you as he speaks. You will help repair the palace stones. His tone makes it clear. This is no honor, only another duty. Yet you feel the eyes of the masons around you, heavy with envy, dread, or both. When you cross the threshold into the palace grounds, the air itself seems different, cooler, scented with cedar. The stones here do not scrape your hands raw. They are polished so smooth you can see your own dusty reflection. Every wall glitters with mosaics of lions and bulls, each stride frozen mid-drawer. For a moment, you forget your place. For a moment, you believe the walls themselves breathe. But soon, you notice what lies behind the beauty. Servants scurry like shadows, their faces blank, their bodies bending too quickly to every command. Guards line the halls, not to keep enemies out, but to keep secrets in. And those secrets are loud. You hear them in whispers drifting from doorways, in laughter that cuts too sharp, in the rustle of silk against the floor. The palace is not a home, it is a stage. Historians still argue whether royal chambers in Urukor later, Rome were truly centers of ritual politics, or whether tales of indulgence were exaggerated by jealous rivals. But walking these corridors, you feel the truth pressing in on you. Every kiss, every embrace, every whispered promise is not just personal, but political. You see it first when the queen passes. She does not look at you, yet you feel her presence like the sun. Perfumed, veiled, her steps echo with a rhythm that demands attention. Beside her walks a priest, his hand brushing hers in a way too casual for chance. No one gasps, no one dares. Instead, the guards stand taller, as if shielding not the queen's body, but the scandal her touch creates. Later, you glimpse the king himself, reclining on a couch, his hand heavy with rings. A musician plays before him, plucking strings that tremble in the air like nervous breaths. A dancer sways nearby, her movements graceful but edged with desperation. You realize then the king is not watching the dancer. He is watching the courtiers who watch the dancer, measuring their hunger, their envy, their loyalty. Every gesture in this hall is a test, every smile a weapon. You, with your dust-streaked tunic and calloused hands, feel invisible. And yet you know invisibility is safer here. Because the moment eyes fall on you, you risk being dragged into the performance, and once inside, you may never leave. At night, when your work is done, you linger in the shadows of the outer courtyard. From there, you hear the laughter spill from the royal chamber's laughter too wild, too sharp, followed by sudden silence, the kind that hides more than it reveals. You imagine the palace beds not as places of rest but as battlegrounds, where alliances are forged in whispers and destroyed with a sigh. The masons had warned you once, half-joking, that even kings wield lust as a sword. Now you see the blade for yourself. One morning, a courtier who had stood proudly at the king's side is gone, his chamber stripped bare. No one speaks his name, yet everyone avoids his shadow, as though it still lingers in the hall. You overhear a servant whisper that his tongue spoke too freely after wine, confessing affections meant to remain hidden. Historians still debate whether such disappearances were executions, exiles, or inventions. But you do not need a tablet or inscription to know what you saw in the palace. Intimacy is currency, and currency spent poorly is deadly. One evening, as you smooth plaster against a wall, a young servant lingers nearby. His hands tremble as he carries a tray, and when he passes, he mutters, "Be careful." The words are so quiet, you almost believe you imagined them. But his eyes wide frighten tell you he did not. After that, you notice the servants more. The ones who avert their gaze when a noble passes, the ones whose lips are bitten raw from holding back words. You realize they are unwilling actors, forced to witness the play without applause. Their silence, the price of survival. And you wonder, is the palace so different from the temple? Both cloak themselves in beauty. Both demand obedience. Both feed on the bodies and hearts of those within. Only the masks change priests draped in incense, nobles draped in silk. Still, there is one difference. The temple binds you with fear of gods. The palace binds you with hunger for power. And hunger, you realize, can be even more dangerous than fear. One night, as you prepare to leave, a courtesan approaches. Her face is painted, her smile gentle, but her eyes are sharp as obsidian. She leans close and whispers, "Even stonecutters can be useful. Remember that." Then she vanishes into the hall, her laughter trailing behind like perfume. The words haunt you as you walk back through the city streets. You are just a laborer, a shadow in the corner of their grand stage. And yet, somehow, you are seen, which means, sooner or later, you will be pulled into the play, whether you choose it or not. As the ziggurat glows under the moon, you feel Uruk tighten its grip. The temple watches your soul. The palace watches your body. And you caught between banquet and chain, between desire and fear, wonder if you will ever belong to yourself again. If you ever wanted to understand how Rome survived, not just as a place of marble facades and triumphal arches, but as a city of 1,000,000 souls stacked together, like clay pots in a kiln, you would need to go below the streets. The grand avenues, the noisy marketplaces, the barracks filled with sweating recruits and shouting centurions, all of it depended on what you would never see. The invisible rivers, the vaulted cisterns, the hidden channels carved out of tufa and brick beneath your feet. You walk with the patrol at dawn, your sandals clicking against the basalt slabs, and you hear nothing of the world below. But if you crouched and pressed your ear to a crack in the pavement, you might catch the faint, hollow rush of water echoing through darkness. That sound, though invisible, is the heartbeat of Rome. The cisterns are not romantic. They are damp, mold-breathed, rank with the tang of iron and lime. Descend a set of narrow maintenance steps with a lamp, and you find yourself in a cavern where arches stretch overhead like the rib cage of a dead god. Drips fall with maddening slowness, splashing into pools slick with algae. The air tastes of stone rot. And yet, this subterranean world is the city's lifeline. It begins, of course, with the aqueducts. They march from the hills, arcs of stone striding across valleys, carrying mountain streams to the capital. But gravity alone cannot guarantee distribution. Once the water reaches Rome, it has to be stored, regulated, and directed. The cisterns' massive reservoirs tucked under temples, forums, even private villas do the work of moderation. They collect what the aqueducts deliver and hold it until pipes and lead conduits can siphon it off. You, Dante, think about this. When you drink a ladle of cold water from the barracks, well, you don't think of it when you splash your face in the morning basin. You don't think of it even when you line up at the public fountain, watching streams arc endlessly from carved lion heads. You simply assume it is eternal. Rome without water is unimaginable. Rome with water is inevitable. But the men who tend the cisterns know otherwise. They are not glamorous like the engineers who build bridges or pave roads. They are keepers of silence, moving through shadow with their tools, scraping away lime deposits, patching cracks with pozzolanic cement, clearing the nests of rats and pigeons that squeeze through grates. Their tunics stink of damp stone and mold. Their hands are always raw. You will never see their names carved on triumphal arches. And yet, without them, the empire collapses in a week. For soldiers like you, the connection to cisterns is both indirect and intimate. Water discipline is as serious as weapons drill. A cohort on the march carries its own ration schedule, and officers will flog men who waste their measure. Thirst is a sharper punishment than lashes. When you arrive at a frontier fort, you do not ask about the enemy. First you ask about the well, the cistern, the aqueduct channel. If the water is foul or scarce, morale collapses faster than under enemy arrows. Rome has learned to weaponize its own cisterns. During sieges, entire neighborhoods are sustained by underground reservoirs, sealed and guarded by soldiers who understand that every drop is life. At Masada, in the burning Judean desert, rebels held out for years because of cisterns carved into the rock long before Rome came. When the legions finally broke through, they found chambers filled with water more valuable than treasure. Even in defeat, the rebels' cisterns mocked Rome's arrogance, a reminder that stone and water can conspire to resist steel. In peacetime, the cisterns are still sites of control. The urban prefect dispatches inspectors to check water levels and ensure no one has illegally tapped a line. Entire fortunes are made and lost in water theft. Wealthy villa owners bribe laborers to extend a secret pipe from public conduits into their private baths. If caught, the penalty is severe fines, confiscation, even exile. Yet the theft continues because luxury in Rome is measured in water. How many fountains gurgle in your courtyard? How many baths steam in your cellar? How many garden pools shimmer in the sun? The irony, of course, is that while patricians soak in hot perfumed baths, entire insulae of the poor make do with a single fountain for hundreds of tenants. There, Children queue with clay jugs, women scrub laundry, old men squat to wash their faces. Sometimes the flow slows to a trickle and tempers flare. A cracked pipe in a cistern block away means a day without water, and yet the aqueducts still march proudly across the horizon, symbols of abundance to anyone looking from the outside. You have stood watch over cisterns before. During food riots, mobs would rush fountains to fill skins and barrels. The prefect knew that guarding grain stores mattered, but guarding water stores mattered more. Bread sustains for a day, water sustains for life, and a thirsty crowd is more dangerous than a hungry one. There is another side to cisterns that soldiers whisper about: the bodies. Rome disposes of its unwanted in many ways: cremation pits, execution fields, the Tiber itself. But in the chaos of riots or purges, some disappear into the black mouths of cisterns. An empty chamber sealed with mortar is as silent a tomb as any mausoleum. Years later, when maintenance crews break through, they sometimes find skeletons twisted in eternal thirst, ribs gnawed by rats, skulls half submerged in stagnant pools. You try not to think of this when you drink from the fountain, but the knowledge lingers like a shadow in your throat. You would never call a cistern sacred. It is not a temple. There are no altars, no incense, no gods painted on the walls. And yet, in a strange way, it is more sacred than marble shrines above. For what is more divine than the power to give life? Priests may promise salvation, generals may promise glory, but water delivers survival. That makes the men who maintain the cisterns accidental priests of a kind, ministers of the hidden sacraments of Rome. Sometimes, in the dead of night, you imagine what would happen if the cisterns failed. If cracks went unmended, if lime deposits, you smell the fire before you see it. The reek of pitch and resin rides the night air, sharper than the usual stew of dung, sweat, and frying oil that hangs over Rome. Then comes the glow-flickering orange against the black rooftops, bouncing on the plastered walls like a demon stretching its claws. By the time you hear the cries, it is already too late for calm. Rome does not burn quietly. It roars. Timber beams crack like whips. Tiles explode with concussive pops. Shutters fall and shatter. Sparks scatter upward into the night, carried by a wind that always seems to favor destruction. A single brazier overturned, a cooking pot knocked astray, a lamp dropped in an alleyand, an entire insula of families vanishes in flame. The soldiers are called first, not priests or magistrates. Not because you are specially trained, but because you are already awake, already disciplined, already standing by with orders to obey. Rome has no formal fire brigades in your time-only gangs, hired by the rich to protect their own districts and the raw issel of soldiers like you when disaster spreads beyond control. The order comes sharp and simple, to the bucket line. The cisterns you once ignored become everything. You run to the nearest fountain, where slaves and citizens are already tearing at the waterspouts with clay jars and wooden buckets. Soldiers muscle their way in, forming two lines, one toward the blaze, one away. The first passes brimming vessels hand to hand. The second returns them empty. It is a rhythm that has not changed since men first built cities. Bucket, pass, throw, return. Your arms ache within minutes. The heat sears your eyes. You cannot hear commands over the roar of burning roofs. Flames leap streets in seconds. Narrow alleys act like bellows, funneling wind straight into the heart of the fire. Families scream as they scramble down staircases already choked with smoke. Some leap from windows, breaking bones on cobblestones, but living, others vanish, their voices snuffed out mid-scream. Your job is not mercy. Your job is containment. Men swing blades into beams, dragging down entire walls while embers rain on their shoulders. It feels like madness destroying homes to save homes, but in fire there is no other logic. The bucket line continues, a human chain of desperation. Clay shatters, water spills, men curse. The flames seem to mock you, drinking whole streams of water without dimming. You cannot pour enough fast enough. For every bucket cast, 10 new tongues of fire lick upward. The smell is unbearable: pitch, tar, scorched wool, burning flesh. You gag, but there is no time to vomit. Another bucket slaps into your hand. In the chaos, you see the hierarchy of Rome dissolved. Senators and beggars alike form part of the chain. Patrician women, their hair wild, stagger under the weight of sloshing jugs. Street urchins dart through smoke to snatch buckets, earning a slap or a word of thanks, depending on whose hands they brush. Slaves fight beside their masters, neither thinking of chains when the fire is licking their heels. For a brief and terrible hour, Rome forgets its divisions. Everyone is simply human, and everyone is simply afraid. The soldiers, though, bear the brunt. When looters slink through smoke to pry jewels from burning homes, it is soldiers ordered to cut them down on sight. You do not question, you act, and the fire keeps eating. Sometimes you win. Sometimes the wind shifts, the bucket line holds, the firebreak bites deep enough, and the blaze gutters out, leaving only smoldering shells of houses. You cheer hoarsely, coughing black smoke, and for a moment you feel like a savior. But sometimes you lose. Sometimes the wind laughs at your effort and drives the inferno forward. House after house, forum after forum. You think of the great fire, though it has not yet come in your lifetime, when for 6 days Rome will burn, and men will whisper that the emperor himself watched it with a lyre. The memory of that catastrophe lives in every soldier's bones, even if it is still years ahead. Each new blaze feels like a rehearsal for apocalypse, and in truth, there is no winning. Even when a fire is contained, lives are ruined. Hundreds left homeless in the ashes, crowding temples and porticos with bundles of charred belongings, begging for bread and shelter. The poor always suffer most, their insulae reduced to ash, while marble villas merely scorch and blacken. You will walk past them later, still smelling of smoke, and hear their curses spat at soldiers. You saved the rich quarter, not ours. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps the bucket line was always tilted toward the powerful. For you, the fire lingers. Days later, you still cough soot, still wake at night to phantom screams. Your hands stay blistered from hot buckets. The smell of burning flesh clings to your nostrils, no matter how often you wash. You thought death would come from an enemy's sword, a barbarian spear, maybe even a fever sweeping the barracks. You didn't think it would come from a trickle of water, clean, cold. The aqueducts are Rome's pride. They stride across valleys like stone giants, their arches silhouetted against the sky, their channels carrying mountain springs into the belly of the city. Visitors marvel, citizens boast, engineers preen. This is why Rome rules the world, they say. We can bend rivers to our will, but you, the soldier who drinks from them, know what lurks inside. You taste it first as a metallic temps on your tongue. At the fountain near your barracks, the water splashes bright, but after swallowing, your lips feel numb, your head swims. The cook complains, the stew tastes strange. A mule that drinks too much stumbles and foams at the mouth. The officers shrugged. Minerals, they say. The mountain rocks. You are not so sure, because you've seen the pipes. On rare days, when soldiers are assigned maintenance work, you march down into the underbelly of the city, where water runs through lead channels, gleaming heavy, poisonous. You chip scale from their sides. You patch cracks with molten metal. You cough on fumes that burn your throat raw. The engineers assure you it is safe. The water keeps moving, they say. It carries no harm. But then why do your hands blister? Why does your friend's hair fall in clumps? Historians still argue whether lead poisoning truly gnawed at Rome's bones, or whether the empire was undone by greed, war, and hubris alone. But standing knee-deep in the dripping tunnels, you don't need debates. You feel the weight of the metal in your chest. You see it in the pallor of men too young to look so gray. And water is only the beginning. The baths, beloved temples of cleanliness, become breeding grounds of sickness. Hundreds cram shoulder to shoulder, steam thick as fog, oil and sweat mingling in the pools. A man coughs beside you, another sneezes into the water. And suddenly, you wonder if this daily ritual of health is instead a quiet contagion. Fever spreads faster than gossip in these marble halls. Your stomach clenches often. Sometimes it's the meat, salted until it tastes more brine than flesh. Sometimes it's the bread, bulked with chalk to stretch the flour. And sometimes it's simply the water again, carrying not just minerals, but filthby, 'cause the same aqueducts that feed fountains also spill into sewers. Rome is mighty, but Rome is messy, and when the drains back up, waste seeps into wells. You remember one summer when the Tiber itself turned foul. Fish floated belly up, their scales dulled. People still drank from it, desperate in the heat. Within days, whole families were struck with cramps, vomiting, fevers that left them too weak to rise. The priests called it divine punishment. You called it what it was, poisoned water. The officers don't like you talking this way. A soldier obeys, not questions. They remind you, yet they don't stop you from fetching water anyway. Thirst is stronger than fear. You gulp it down, knowing each swallow might carve years from your life. And then there are the fevers. Malaria, you hear the medics call it, though to you it is simply the swamp sickness. Every summer it rises, a haze over the lowlands. The mosquitoes bite at dusk, their whine like tiny arrows in your ear. Soon after, the chills begin. One man shivers so hard his teeth crack. Another burns so hot he claws at his own skin. The barracks reek of sweat and despair. You survive some bouts, lose comrades to others. The healers bring bitter herbs, mutter charms, even bleed men in hopes of drawing the sickness out. Nothing works. You learn to dread the buzz in your ear more than the clash of swords. An enemy you can stab, a mosquito never. And yet, despite all this, Rome keeps drinking, keeps bathing, keeps marching. It is as if the city itself refuses to admit its water carries death. The aqueducts are monuments too grand to doubt. The baths are pleasures too sweet to surrender. So you swallow the poison with pride, telling yourself you are part of the empire's miracle. Still, in the quiet hours, you wonder. Perhaps Rome's downfall will not come from invaders or revolts. Perhaps it will come from within, from every pipe, every bucket, every steaming bath. An empire corroded not by enemies, but by its own veins of lead. One night, after guard duty, you lean against a fountain and watch the moon ripple on its surface. A child fills a jar beside you, humming a tune. You want to tell her not to drink, to fetch water from a stream instead. But the streams are far, the aqueduct is here, and her family will not believe a weary soldier's warning over an engineer's pride. So you stay silent. You drink, too. What else can you do? The water is cold, smooth, refreshing. It slides down your throat like liquid silver, leaving only a faint, metallic aftertaste. You close your eyes and let it linger, because in Rome, even poison tastes like glory. And maybe, just maybe, that is the most Roman truth of all. You wake not to the sound of a trumpet or a centurion's bark, but to a low, rumbling growl that vibrates the very ground beneath your cot. At first, you think it's your stomach. Then the walls tremble, the roof creaks, and you realize Rome itself is shifting in its sleep. Earthquakes are not rare, though no one speaks of them until the stones fall. The empire pretends its buildings are eternal, its arches unbreakable, its columns fixed forever in place. But beneath your boots, the earth has other plans. The floor lurches, amphorae topple and smash, their wine bleeding into the dust. Men curse, some still tangled in blankets, others stumbling for doorways. A beam cracks overhead, showering plaster like snow. You dive outside, joining a flood of soldiers spilling into the street, all blinking at the night sky, as if it might offer answers. But the ground does not care. It rolls again, bucking like a horse. Roof tiles rain down in clatters, chimneys tumble, statues topple. Somewhere nearby, a wall collapses with a sound like thunder. Screams cut through the dark, high and human. Historians still argue whether Rome's deadliest quakes were punishments from the gods, freak geological spasms, or simply exaggerations woven into chronicles. For you, no debate is needed. The ground moves, you move with it, helpless. The officers shout for order, as though discipline can tame the planet. Form up, stay together. But men scatter anyway, some to rescue friends, others simply to run. You chase one comrade as he vanishes into the smoke of collapsing bakeries. The smell of scorched flour clogs your nose, mixing with dust so thick you cough until your ribs ache. And then, just as suddenly, silence. The ground steadies. Dogs whimper, lamps sway. For a heartbeat, the city holds its breath. Then comes the fire. A tremor may topple walls, but it is flame that finishes the ruin. Shattered oil lamps ignite splinters. Collapsed kitchens belch sparks. Soon, tongues of fire crawl through alleys already piled with rubble. You find yourself again in the bucket line, just as in those earlier nights. Only this time the ground itself feels like an enemy waiting to strike again. The temples, of course, open their doors. Priests stream into the streets, chanting, holding up sacred relics. Some citizens drop to their knees, begging forgiveness. You watch one man lash himself bloody with a whip, crying that Jupiter must be appeased. A woman beside him offers bread into the air, as though the gods might swoop down to snatch it. You've seen fear before, but never this raw fear, not of invaders, not of fire, but of the earth itself. And through it all, the soldiers keep moving stones. You haul away rubble from a collapsed insula, your hands bleeding, your lungs burning with dust. Beneath one beam, you find a child, her small body curled like a bird's. You lift her out, coughing, only to realize she does not stir. You place her gently aside, muttering a prayer you barely remember. Then return to the rubble, because there are still voices crying beneath it. The Empire has no word for trauma, but you carry it anyway. Nights later, you still dream of walls buckling, of statues swaying like drunken giants, of a hand reaching up from under stone only to fall limp. When morning comes, Rome limps. Cracks run jagged through marble columns once thought immortal. The aqueduct groans where its arches lean. People gather in fields, too afraid to return indoors. The market stalls are empty. Bread is scarce. The city is not conquered, but it feels broken. And yet, life resumes, always. The rubble is cleared, the walls rebuilt, the temples rededicated. The senators declare omens, the priests demand sacrifices, the engineers patch stones. Rome stitches itself together with the same stubbornness it always does. Still, you can't shake the memory of that rolling earth, that moment when the empire's marble skin cracked to reveal how fragile it all is. You remember men whispering afterward, if the earth itself turns against Rome, what hope is left? No one answers, of course, no one dares. But you carry the question in your bones, as permanent as the scars on your hands. Because deep down you know, for all its legions, all its arches, all its gods, Rome stands not on unshakable ground, but on trembling soil. And when the earth yawns again, it will be there once more, clutching a bucket. The army teaches you that wounds come from spears, swords, or maybe an arrow if fortune frowns. The streets of Rome teach you otherwise. You limp through them one evening after duty, craving bread and maybe a scrap of sleep. Instead, you find yourself in the middle of a festival, or what passes for one. Drunken men spill from taverns, their tunics crooked, their laughter sharp. A dice game has collapsed into shoving. Somewhere a flute shrills out of tune, cut short by a crash of pottery. The knife appears almost casually, not in battle lines, not with honor, but in the fist of a boy barely grown, his eyes bright with wine and rage. He lunges at another reveler, misses, stumbles, and nearly collides with you. For a heartbeat you stare, confused. Then he snarls, waves the blade, and vanishes into the crowd. That is Rome's secret wound, not on the frontiers, but in her own alleys. Street violence hums like a constant drumbeat. Gangs prowl at night, some wearing colors like soldiers, others hiding behind cloaks. Gladiators discharged from the arena swagger through markets, eager to prove their scars still matter. Foreign slaves, their tongues strange, gather in corners with eyes too sharp, and always knives glint in the dark. Historians still argue whether the Collegio's neighborhood clubs were harmless guilds or barely disguised gangs. You don't need a scroll to tell you. You see the bruises, the broken teeth, the blood that trickles between cobblestones. One night, an officer assigns you and a handful of others to patrol. Not glory, not triumph, just walking the streets with torches, making sure the city doesn't tear itself apart. The first hour is quiet. Then you hear it, a cry, thin and panicked. You find a man pinned against a wall, 3 youths hammering fists into his gut. One has his purse already half loosened. You bark, shove forward, and they scatter fast as rats when the torchlight hits. The victim slumps to the ground, groaning, muttering thanks between missing teeth. You haul him upright and move on. By morning, you know he'll be back in the same alleys, hoping fortune shifts his way. The violence is not just random. It is soaked into Rome's stones. Factions run wild. The blue and green chariot fans, their rivalry as bloody as any battlefield. When races run, fists fly, stones arc, sometimes blades flash. More than once, you've been stationed at the Circus Maximus, not to enjoy the spectacle, but to keep rioters from burning it down. Imagine dying not in war, but in a brawl over horse colors, yet many do. The city hides scars, too. You pass shrines hastily rebuilt, their offerings blackened. You hear of men who never came home from taverns, their bodies found in the Tiber days later, bloated and unclaimed. Everyone whispers about the Subura, that tangle of brothels, gambling dens, and shadow markets, where even soldiers tread carefully. Rome calls herself the Eternal City, but her heart beats with knives. One evening, you see it up close. A comrade stumbles back to the barracks, clutching his thigh. Blood pours between his fingers. Mugged, he gasps. 3 of them didn't even ask. Just cut. You help bind the wound with rags, press hard until his screams fade into whimpers. He survives, barely. But for weeks he hobbles, the limp a reminder that glory is not what maims you here, petty theft is. Sometimes the violence rises higher. Senators themselves hire gangs, masked as clients, to intimidate rivals. Elections turn into street wars, scrolls forgotten while fists and stones decide the outcome. You hear of one riot where a candidate's toga was ripped to shreds while he fled, bleeding down the forum. Rome may write laws on bronze, but it enforces them with blood in the gutter. You start carrying a blade, even off-duty. Not a gladius too obvious, too heavy, but a simple dagger tucked at your belt. You tell yourself it is for defense, but you know better. In Rome, the line between victim and brawler blurs quickly, and through it all, the people shrug. Life is cheap in a city this vast. Someone dies in a tavern fight. Another tenant takes his room by dawn. A brawl in the Subura leaves 3 corpses. The tavern reopens by nightfall. Violence is not an exception. It is background noise, yet it wears on you. You lie awake, listening for footsteps outside the barracks, for voices raised too sharply, for the scrape of steel in the dark. You think of battles beyond the frontier and realize they may be cleaner than these alleys. At least there, the enemy is known. But in Rome, the knife could belong to anyone. A boy with dice in his pocket, a senator's hired thug, a drunk with nothing left to lose. You learn to watch eyes more than blades. You learn to keep your back against walls. You learn that the city you fight to protect may bleed you out in an alley without ever knowing your name. And one day, when the city whispers of another soldier found dead in the Tiber throat slit, purse gone, you feel nothing but weariness, because you know it could have been you, and one day it still might. That is Rome's other battlefield, not the fields of Gaul, not the deserts of Parthia, but the cobbled streets under flickering lamps, where blood soaks the stones and drains unnoticed into the sewers. And you, soldier, are just another body, waiting for the knife. The rumors reach you before the smoke does. Whispers trickle through the barracks, carried on the tongues of merchants and slaves alike. The city is burning. You want to dismiss it as drunken exaggeration, but then the smell hits a harsh sting of charred wood, pitch, and something worse, something that clings to the back of your throat like death itself. You step outside, and the horizon glows red. Not sunset, fire. Rome burns. The streets are chaos. People scream, stumble, shove, carrying whatever they can snatch in their arms. A bronze lamp, a child half asleep, a jug of oil sloshing dangerously close to open flame. Others kneel in despair, clutching household gods rescued from collapsing roofs. The flames leap from insula to insula with terrifying hunger. Dry timbers, tar-coated beams, oil lamps overturned in panic. Every street is kindling. You are ordered to help. No real plan, just that word. Help. You grab buckets, form a line with other soldiers, sloshing water onto walls already cracking. Useless. The fire laughs at your effort, roaring louder, brighter, climbing higher. Whole districts vanish overnight. The worst is not the flames, though is the crush of bodies, the panic. Men trample their neighbors. Women wail for children lost in the stampede. A bridge collapses under the weight of fleeing families, plunging them, screaming, into the Tiber. You see a woman clutch her baby too tightly, smothering it in terror as she pushes through the crowd. And everywhere, the sound, the crack of beams, the shriek of horses, the roar of fire swallowing Rome whole. By dawn, smoke chokes the sky, blotting out the sun. Ash drifts like snow, settling on your armor, your hair, your lashes. The city looks less like the capital of the world, and more like the ruins of Troy, sung in old poems. And then come the rumors. Some say Nero lit the fire himself, desperate to clear land for his golden palace. Others whisper it was the Christians, that strange sect who refuse to honor Rome's gods, who meet in shadows and talk of one God only. Accusations fly faster than embers. Soldiers are told to seize anyone suspicious. What counts as suspicious? A man clutching scriptures, a woman refusing to throw incense on an altar. It doesn't matter. You drag them away as the crowd cheers, half grateful, half baying for blood. You want to believe the empire is innocent of its own suffering. But then you march past Nero's new construction, marble foundations rising where ashes still smoke, and you wonder, did Rome's emperor burn his own people for a dream of grandeur? You'll never know. History will gnaw on that question forever, while you remember only the screams. The fire changes the city. The poor are scattered, their homes gone, their lives reduced to rubble. Refugee camps swell in fields outside the walls, crowded with smoke-stained faces and hollow eyes. The rich, less harmed, seize the chance to expand their villas. You watch as senators purchase blackened plots for a handful of coins, promising to rebuild, and you know the cycle. Tragedy for some, profit for others. Even after the flames die, Rome doesn't sleep. The nights glow faintly with hidden embers, buildings collapsing without warning. Rats flee in droves, carrying plague into the camps. Merchants grow rich, selling timber and nails at outrageous prices. Beggars grow more desperate, hands outstretched even as ash still clings to their brows. And beneath it all, fear simmers. People whisper about divine punishment, about gods enraged. Priests lead processions through the streets, chanting, spilling wine, slaughtering oxen to appease Jupiter. But the prayers feel thin, hollow. Rome has bled too much to believe the gods are listening. You remember one night most clearly, ordered to patrol the smoldering ruins. You walk past a collapsed insula where smoke still hisses from the rubble. A boy sits there, barefoot, his face gray with soot. He clutches a wooden toy horse, its mane burned away, its legs charred. He stares at nothing. You crouch, reach for him, but he doesn't move. He doesn't even blink. The fire took more than homes. It hollowed people out. The city rebuilds, of course. Rome always rebuilds. New streets are laid wider, straighter. Stone replaces timber where possible. Statues rise again, cleaner, brighter. But to you, the air never loses that smell, the stench of burning, of despair baked into the city's bones. And the memory stays, running with a bucket that could never quench, dragging screaming prisoners who may or may not have been guilty. Watching temples collapse, while senators argued who to blame, soldiers dream of battle glory, of shields locked against barbarian hordes. No one dreams of this, fighting a fire with empty hands, fighting despair with nothing but orders barked into smoke. You once thought Rome eternal, unshakable, but standing in the ashes, you realize something truer. It only takes one spark, one drunken hand, one cruel ambition to bring an empire to its knees. And you, soldier, will always remember the night the world's greatest city felt fragile as straw in the wind. The ashes settle, but the whispers do not. You walk Rome's streets months after the fire, and everywhere you turn, rumors cling to you like smoke that refuses to wash out of your cloak. The temples are rebuilt, the markets buzz again, but you feel the hollowness under the marble, as if the city itself knows it's living on borrowed time. Nero's golden house rises on the Palatine Hill, gleaming in fresh marble and gilded ceilings, sprawling gardens stretching where families once lived. You can't help but feel the sting. The fire wasn't only a tragedy, it was an opportunity. People still mutter that Nero played his lyre as the city burned. Historians still argue whether that story is true, but you can't shake the Imogen emperor serenading the flames that swallowed his people. The trials come next. Christians, already mistrusted, become scapegoats. You're ordered to round them up, men, women, even children, and deliver them to the arenas. The crowds howl for vengeance, and you stand guard as the condemned are thrown to beasts or nailed to crosses, smeared with pitch and set aflame to light Nero's gardens. You don't know what crime they committed, except the crime of being different. But difference is enough when Rome needs someone to blame. One night, you're stationed by the amphitheater when the crowd erupts in a cheer. A lion drags down a thin man clutching a wooden cross, his body swallowed in the animal's jaws. You turn away, but the sound follows, the crowd's roar, blending with the lion's snarl, the man's final gasp. That night, you can't sleep. You wonder if mercy has a place in Rome, or if cruelty is the only currency left. Yet life presses on. The baker's stalls reopen, selling loaves shaped like laurel wreaths to mock tragedy with satire. Senators host feasts in villas rebuilt even grander than before. Poets compose verses on Rome's resilience, as though words alone can cover the charred scars. And you, soldier, continue to march, to drill, to keep order in a city that feels less like the eternal Rome, and more like a stage set ready to collapse behind its painted scenery. But you also see resilience where you least expect it. Refugee camps give birth to new communities. Children who lost everything learn trades, hammering nails into planks, weaving baskets, carrying water for builders. A widow opens a small stall in the forum, selling bread baked in borrowed ovens, laughing despite the wrinkles of grief carved into her face. Rome is scarred, yes, but still alive. One evening, you pass through a half-rebuilt street and notice a boy sketching in the dust with a stick. It's the same boy you saw weeks earlier, the one clutching the burned toy horse. Now he draws houses, temples, gardens. Not the ruins, his lines are clean, his angles sharp, as if he sees the city not as it is, but as it might become. He looks up at you once, his eyes no longer empty, and for the first time in months, you believe Rome will not only survive, but transform. Still, a question lingers like a splinter under your skin. How many more fires will it take before the city finally collapses? You've seen what one spark can do. You've seen how quickly the proudest walls can crumble, how easily a people can turn on themselves when fear needs a target. Maybe the gods are patient, or maybe they're just waiting. Either way, you know this. Rome's strength is not its marble, its armies, or even its emperors. Rome's strength is its people, their stubbornness to live, to rebuild, to laugh in the face of ash. You keep walking through the twilight, past smoking ruins turned into gardens, past scaffolds creaking under hammer blows, past temples where priests chant louder than their doubts. The city breathes, scarred but unbroken, and so do you. You've carried buckets into flames, dragged prisoners into chains, smelled the stench of a world burning, and you are still here. Rome is still here. And for tonight, that's enough. The fire is out now, and so is the noise. You don't hear crowds cheering, or beams collapsing, or lions roaring. You only hear your own breathing, steady and slow, matching the rhythm of a city that has finally quieted. The dust has settled. The stones are cool again. Rome sleeps. You picture yourself lying back in the grass, outside the walls, the last embers glowing faintly on the horizon like fallen stars. The air is cooler now, touched with the sweetness of night, and you let your shoulders unclench. The sky arches wide above you, black velvet stitched with scattered sparks. It feels endless, patient, and forgiving. Your mind drifts across the ruins, but instead of fire, you see new shoots breaking through charred soil. Instead of screams, you hear the murmur of fountains yet to be built, water pouring steadily into marble basins. The city will rise again and again after that, because that is what people do. They fall, and they rise, and in between they breathe. So, take one last deep breath with Rome. Let it out slowly, letting the tension slip from your jaw, your chest, your hands. Imagine the ashes carried away on the breeze, leaving behind only space for something gentler, something calmer. And as the city rests, so do you. There is nothing more to carry. No buckets, no burdens, no orders shouted over smoke. Just the quiet rhythm of your own heart, steady as a drum in the dark. Close your eyes now. Let the lights of Rome fade into dreams, and let the weight of history become nothing more than a soft whisper reminding you the world burns, but it also heals. And tonight, all you have to do is rest. Good night.